One afternoon in late October of the year 312, a man stood on the northern bank of the Tiber with an empire pressing behind his eyes. He had marched from the cold edge of Britain, crossed the Alps, and beaten two rivals in northern Italy. Now Rome lay just across the river, and behind its walls the Emperor Maxentius waited with an army far larger than his own. For most of that day, the problem was brutally simple. Either Constantine would take the city, or his name would disappear from history. But the battle that followed did more than settle a civil war. It changed what an emperor could worship, what a soldier would carry into combat, and what the Roman state would eventually become. The empire had spent nearly 3 centuries treating Christianity as a small, sometimes dangerous Eastern sect. Within a single lifetime after this day, it would become the favored religion of the throne. That is the real puzzle, how a narrow fight over a bridge became one of the great turning points of the ancient world. To see why, you have to understand the mess Constantine was born into. Rome was no longer ruled by one emperor. Power had been split into a system of 4 rulers called the Tetrarchy, designed to stop the empire from tearing itself apart. But by the year 312, that system had collapsed into civil war. The old persecutions under Diocletian had tried to stamp out Christianity and failed. Churches had been demolished, scriptures burned, and clergy arrested. Yet the faith had not only survived, it had spread through cities, households, and even army camps. The empire itself was restless, overstretched, and full of men who wanted the throne. Constantine had been proclaimed emperor by his father's troops in Britain 6 years earlier. At first, he controlled only the western provinces, and his position was fragile. He spent years campaigning in Britain and Gaul, learning how to command an army in cold, difficult country. Maxentius, by contrast, held Rome and Italy. He had the Praetorian Guard, the walls of the city, and the deep reserves of an old capital. To the east, Licinius and Maximinus watched and waited. Everyone claimed legitimacy. Only victory could prove it. In the spring of 312, Constantine crossed the Alps with a battle-hardened field army. He took Turin, then Milan, and marched south toward Rome. His soldiers were said to be outnumbered, but they were experienced and fiercely loyal. Maxentius faced a hard choice. He could stay behind the walls and force a long siege, or he could meet Constantine in the open. He chose the open field. That decision led both armies to the Milvian Bridge, where the Via Flaminia crossed the Tiber a few miles north of the city. The bridge was not just a crossing, it was the doorway to Rome. Now comes the moment most people remember. On the night before the battle, or in some accounts the day itself, Constantine claimed he received a sign. One source, writing not long after the events, says he had a dream telling him to place a heavenly sign on the shields of his men. Another, written decades later, describes something far more dramatic: a cross of light appearing above the sun, with words promising that in this sign he would conquer. The symbol was the Chi Rho, the first 2 Greek letters of the name Christ, folded into a single monogram. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint it on their shields before the fighting began. Historians still argue about what exactly happened. But for the men who fought, the important thing was that their commander had given them a mark. It was not a normal Roman eagle or thunderbolt. It was a Christian sign, or at least a sign Constantine wanted linked to victory. And that was a gamble. Christianity was legal only in patches and had faced brutal persecutions just a few years earlier. A Roman army marching under a Christian emblem was strange enough to be remembered. The next morning, the two armies met on the north bank of the river. Maxentius had made a dangerous choice. He had placed the Tiber at his back. He had also prepared a pontoon bridge of boats alongside the older stone crossing, giving his army a way to retreat if things went wrong. At first, his praetorians held their ground. They were some of the best paid and best armed troops in the empire. But Constantine led his cavalry in a hard charge on the flank, and the line began to bend. Then, it broke. What followed was not just defeat, but catastrophe. Thousands of Maxentius' soldiers tried to pull back across the narrow boat bridge. The bridge could not hold them. It collapsed under the weight, and men in heavy armor plunged into the Tiber. For hours, the river was choked with bodies, shields, and broken timber. Maxentius himself was caught in the rout. His body was later pulled from the mud, identified by his imperial armor. Constantine had won the city and the Western Empire in a single afternoon. He entered Rome the next day as master of the West. Most people stop there, at the victory. But here is the part that matters for history. Constantine did not simply celebrate and return to ruling as before. He made a quiet but radical choice. Roman emperors traditionally climbed the Capitoline Hill to offer sacrifice to Jupiter after a triumph. Constantine refused. The sources disagree on the details, but the message was clear enough to the senators watching. The new ruler did not intend to treat the old gods as his protectors. That small absence was louder than any victory parade. A few years later, the Senate dedicated a great arch near the Colosseum in his honor. Its inscription credits his victory to divine inspiration, using a careful phrase that could point to the Christian God or to the old gods without offense. That was Constantine's skill. He could signal change without forcing every senator to admit what was happening. He also moved quickly against the old center of power. The Praetorian Guard, which had backed Maxentius, was disbanded. In its place, Constantine began to build a different kind of support. He gave the Bishop of Rome a palace and funded a great basilica. Those gestures were not only about faith, they were about replacing one set of loyalties with another. The next year, in Milan, Constantine and his eastern rival Licinius issued an agreement we now call the Edict of Milan. It was not a law-making Christianity, the state religion. It was broader than that. It granted religious toleration to all, and it ordered that property confiscated from Christians during the persecutions be returned. In practical terms, churches that had been destroyed or handed over could now rebuild and own land. That seems modest on paper, but it was enormous in effect. Think of what changed in a single generation. Before the battle, a Christian congregation was often a hidden group meeting in houses, vulnerable to arrest or worse. After Constantine's victory, bishops began to sit in imperial councils. Church buildings were funded from the emperor's treasury. Clergy were given exemptions from civic duties. Christian communities could receive inheritances and build endowments. A congregation in Rome that had once gathered in a private home could suddenly own property, operate a court, and count the emperor as a patron. Constantine did not make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That would not happen for several more decades under Theodosius. What Constantine did was remove the threat of persecution and place the church at the center of imperial favor. That is a different thing, and in some ways it mattered more. A persecuted sect can survive in hiding, but a legal church with property, tax privileges, and imperial protection can grow into the dominant institution of a civilization. There is also a second puzzle. Was Constantine's vision sincere belief, political calculation, or a mix of both? The honest answer is that we cannot fully know. He continued to use solar imagery and may have been cautious with pagan senators. He was not baptized until he was near death, but his public actions moved consistently in one direction. He funded Christian building projects, gave bishops authority in disputes, and called church councils. Whatever happened in the sky or in his dream, the consequences were real and measurable. By the year 325, the empire had one Christian-friendly emperor at its center. Constantine called bishops from across the Roman world to the city of Nicaea to settle a fierce argument about the nature of Christ. The question was whether Christ was of the same substance as God or something created. That may sound like a fine point of theology, but for Constantine, it was a political problem. A divided church meant a divided empire. The council produced a creed and showed something new. The emperor was now deeply involved in Christian doctrine. A faith that had once been defined by local communities and persecuted teachers was now being shaped inside imperial politics. Constantine later founded a new capital at Byzantium, renamed Constantinople, and the empire's eastern half became a Christian civilization for more than 1,000 years. In 321, he had already made the Day of the Sun an official day of rest, using language that could please both pagans and Christians. That small law quietly remade the week for millions of people. None of this was inevitable on the night before the battle. Maxentius could have stayed behind his walls. The pontoon bridge might have held. The vision might have been forgotten. Instead, one battle on a stone and timber crossing turned a persecuted sect into the church of an empire. So the story of the Milvian Bridge is not really about a cross in the sky. It is about a threshold. Before the battle, Christianity was one of many religions in a pagan state, often punished and always suspect. After the battle, it was the religion of the emperor's household and soon the favored faith of the empire. The change did not happen because everyone converted in a day. It happened because a military victory became a political mandate, and a political mandate became a new world. That is why historians still talk about a bridge over the Tiber. It was not the largest battle Rome ever fought. It was not the last civil war, but it was the moment when the old religious order lost its grip on the throne. From that point on, the question was no longer whether Christianity could survive. The question was how much of the world it would shape, and the answer to that question is still written into the map, the calendar, and the memory of the West.